Hi, everyone. On today's podcast episode, we have Chuck Warner, founder, actually, I should say co-founder of Ada Ventures. And we're going to hear all about Ada Ventures in a second. But as always, first of all, welcome, Chuck.
Thank you. Great to be here.
We're going to kick off with your background. You started off with English Lit, and you went on to BBDO, and then to a couple of venture funds, and then Diversity VC, and then of course now Ada. But kind of let's find out a little bit why you started off with English Lit, moved on in all these different really intriguing ways. Maybe tell us the background behind that.
Yeah, I wish I was smarter and could kind of post-rationalize it in a neater way, but I have to tell you the complete truth, which is that when I was 15, I wanted to be an actress. I was really interested in the theatre. I was sort of persuaded by probably my parents that I probably shouldn't do that and should get a degree first. So I studied English literature. I did a lot of theatre at university. And then again, when I was graduating university, I think I kind of just about missed this tech wave that happened. I went along to the first EF recruitment day that they ever did in Cambridge, and I almost applied for EF as a founder, but I got a kind of real job before I had a chance to do that. So I joined this advertising agency called BBDO, and I did that for a couple of years and really enjoyed that because it was a great kind of combination of something creative but something kind of businessy. And I was always very interested in the intersection of something creative and something more commercial. And so after having done that for a few years, I think I just kept thinking about this technology wave that was just changing everything. And my boyfriend at the time was working at Google, and I was kind of looking at what he was doing and thinking, that's quite interesting. I think he's kind of onto something potentially there. And I then had this incredibly fortunate moment of meeting someone who was starting a new venture fund within an existing business called Downing. And I was lucky enough to go and join him and work at Downing with him. And we both sort of spent a couple of years there, invested about £20 million in about 36 companies. And during that time, I learned just an incredible amount. It was the most amazing opportunity to just get right into deals and just have loads and loads of experience doing deals. And that led me to where we are with Ada, without trying to tell this as too long a story. But yeah, that was kind of my transition into venture. But I can dive into any of those areas if you want to explore them in more detail.
Yeah, what would be great would be to talk a little bit about how the lessons learned in the advertising industry helped you with both venture and starting your own, I guess, fund and company. But it's always great to look at, even if you can't rationalize things in retrospect, but you can still look at some of the lessons learned and how you leverage those. What were those lessons?
Yeah, I think there were two in particular. I think one, and this is a sort of, I think, underrated skill and sort of skill set that not very many venture partners have, is understanding how ideas are going to play out with customers. And I think that one of the things about advertising that's really interesting is that people in advertising spend a huge amount of time trying to understand trends and trying to understand how new product development or new launches or new brands will actually resonate with customers. And that's kind of what we do in venture. We assess markets, we assess themes and trends and what kind of human behavior is going to do. And then we pick companies that are going to execute that behavior change and kind of build something to fit that behavior change. And so I've taken a lot of the learnings around analyzing consumer trends into what I do in venture. And I think that's been really valuable. I think the other aspect is that a lot of companies, most companies, need to sell products at some point in their lives. And a lot of founders don't necessarily have sales and marketing expertise. So what I found with my experience at BBDO is that I was able to help companies think about how to segment their audience, how to come up with acquisition strategies, how to think about how to communicate their brand and their product offering in a really clear and succinct and successful way. And that was something they didn't really find they were getting from other kind of maybe finance or consulting VCs, or from people within their own team who might just be quite technical people who don't necessarily have the background in sales and marketing.
Yeah, and those are very critical elements. And it's actually, it sounds like you really nailed those early, and obviously been leveraging them ever since. But if we go through the time that you spent with Downing and Seraphim, you probably had a chance to not only take some of those ideas and sort of help founders with it, but maybe if you summarize some of the, every single person who works at a fund and leaves it and then creates their own, almost always comes out the other end with like a view of what they would like to do and what they would not like to do. And so maybe if you take those lessons learned from those years and say, okay, well, these are the things that I think I wanted to double down on as part of creating Ada, but these are the things that I perhaps wanted to distance myself without necessarily throwing anyone under the bus. What would you say these things are?
Yeah, I think that there are some really great things that I definitely wanted to double down on from that experience. So, the first one was investing in lots of companies early and doing it at pre-seed and seed stage. When Matt and I first started investing at Downing, we found that we weren't really getting that much competition for deals. It was kind of you guys, frankly, and a couple of others that were investing at the pre-seed and seed stage. And obviously that's changed a lot now, but that was where both Matt and I felt like we had an advantage, and where we could really help the companies kind of shape their go-to-market, shape their product strategy, shape their sort of marketing. And so that was a stage I think we both really wanted to double down on with Ada. The second thing was, one of the learnings I think that we had from Downing was that every company we invested in had to be a kind of unicorn style investment. And I think one of the mistakes that one can make, is looking for things that could be a good fit for a small fund and maybe would lead to a nice kind of small exit, but actually are never going to be interesting to the indexes and the Accels and the later stage venture funds. And I think that with Ada, everything we invest in has to be interesting to those later stage venture funds. And I think the third thing that we did reasonably well, but definitely could do better at Downing, was helping companies internationalize and helping companies access the US market in particular. And we had a bit of an unfair advantage about that because Matt had spent a long time in the US and was based out there and had a good network there. So again, we've sort of taken that forward into Ada and wanted to sort of really build on those three areas. I think something that we perhaps didn't do as well, which I think is something we've tried to do much better with Ada, is really build a brand around what we're doing. And I think that sounds very lofty. We're still only in our first sort of 3 months of investing, so we're super early, and I'm aware of the danger of us falling flat on this. But I think you have to have intentionality, and you have to start somewhere with building a brand. And we have, between ourselves, a pretty clear mission of what we're trying to do with Ada and why it's different. Our job is to communicate that to founders and other investors. So that's one thing that we're spending a lot of time thinking about and have put a lot of work into trying to shape.
Well, I want to come back to that, and just to help you with the question I'm going to ask you down the road is around some of the lessons that you learned the hard way during those times, because I think we all make mistakes in our career, and it's not just necessarily career choices, but mistakes and lessons we learn from it. And some of those you might be implementing today with Ada, but some might just be some that you would recommend to anybody who's kind of starting a new fund or is working in venture. But moving on from your time there, Downing and Seraphim, to the creation of Diversity VC, walk us through why. Like, what was the moment that you said, I want to do this? What was the goal, and what has been the outcome?
Yeah, so first of all, it wasn't just me. It was myself, Lillian, Travis, Anna, Farouk, Jules, Ben. There's lots of people who've been involved in the kind of founding story of Diversity VC. But really, it was a collection of us who were working at the time as associates in different funds, and felt that there was a gap in, no one was really addressing the fact that when we looked around us, when we went to events, when we met founders, when we were in our own offices, in our investment committees, there were just very few other people that weren't white and that weren't male and that weren't, from very specific backgrounds, Oxbridge, Stanford, Harvard, etc. And we felt that wasn't right. And so we set up this nonprofit with the objective of trying to make the venture capital industry more diverse. And the reason why we cared about the venture capital industry was because, first of all, we had a sort of point of view on it because we worked in it, so we felt we could change it. But secondly, that it has a disproportionate impact on the companies that then get built. So 6 out of the 10 most valuable companies in the world started out being venture backed, and they employ literally hundreds of thousands of people. And so the sort of early culture and the early philosophy of the people that fund those companies has a huge impact and bearing on how diverse and how inclusive those companies that get built are. So that was what led us to really wanting to sort of focus on VC. And we've done kind of 4 things. We've done a lot of data collection and published a lot of data on what's going on in D&I. We have helped young people from different backgrounds get into the industry through a program called Future VC. We have helped VCs themselves to be more inclusive through sort of practical tools and resources. And we've helped entrepreneurs access capital.
So, by the way, I don't know if I shared this with you before, but we're also participants in Included VC. I don't know if you know those guys that are also trying to tackle this issue. But if we delve deeper into some of the research and sort of outputs that you guys have done, it'd be great to get some highlights from it, just for those that are listening and that are not familiar with it. But also it would be interesting to see what things are counterintuitive that came out the other end.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we started out looking at the sort of most easily accessible data point, which was gender. Us as an organization, we look far beyond gender and we think of diversity as a sort of intersectional question. But we looked at gender initially and we saw that when we did our first study in 2017, actually half of all of the venture funds in the UK had no women on their investment teams at all. And 2/3 of venture funds in the UK had no women at all. Sorry, the senior sort of investment teams. So that was kind of quite a stark realization of a first data study that we did. We've since gone on to do quite a lot of work looking at different areas of diversity in the venture capital teams. So in 2019, we looked at ethnicity and educational background. And I think, we broadly see the same thing, which is that people tend to come from the same places, so privately educated. Many are coming from Oxbridge and Stanford and Harvard, so 1 in 5 come from that background, and they're majority white. So it's 84% white in the sort of self-selected industry study that we did, and that compares to kind of 59% of the London population, and London is the capital of VC in the UK. So it doesn't show a great picture. I think what's interesting and perhaps counterintuitive that came out of that study was looking at career background, because when we looked through scraping LinkedIn, we found that only 4% of VCs in the UK actually had technology company experience, and not many of them had technology founder experience either. So I think that was kind of probably quite shocking, and probably the most shocking thing that came out of the study was that actually the people who are investing in these companies don't necessarily have the expertise, and they don't have the background always to correctly advise the companies that they're investing in.
So it sounds like the interesting bit there is that the raw material is out there in terms of entrepreneurship. It's just that from the investment side of view, there's blinders. And so therefore people are trying to fit things in specific molds, and therefore not necessarily seeing how much is actually being done by people who don't fit that mold. Is that the key takeaway?
Yeah, I think that is. I mean, we still don't know anything enough about sort of how people make decisions, and how and why this data kind of plays out and makes for such a sort of non-inclusive technology landscape. One of the things that was really interesting about another study that we did was that we looked at the entrepreneurial community, and we saw that in 2017, 89p in every pound invested went to all female teams, and just all male teams, and just 1p went to all female teams. And that one of the sort of leaders into that was that you're 13 times more likely to get investment if you have a warm introduction to a fund. And these all-female teams and mixed gender teams just tended to not have these warm introductions. And I think that's true of diverse teams in general. They don't necessarily have the kind of networks and weak ties that tie them into the VC industry. And that means they don't get in front of people. So I'm kind of on a massive campaign, and we are at Diversity VC, to sort of enforce these different kinds of networks and make sure that people are spending time in different networks so that they're not just funding the same kinds of people over and over again.
Yeah, and did you find that there was any interesting sector breakdown?
In terms of the founders that got funded?
Yeah, founders that got funded, or where diversity was more prevalent versus less prevalent. Was there any interesting tidbits there?
There were, and I don't have the data to hand, but it wasn't sort of that surprising in that healthcare was more diverse. Deep tech and life sciences was slightly less diverse. It was kind of along the lines of what you would expect.
And if we broke out diversity and tackling diversity in short term versus long term, what are the long-term things that we need to put into motion today to really harvest this? Because I think the short term has its limits, right? Like there's a whole bunch of spectrum of people's recommendations on how to deal with things in the short term. But long term is where you really see the fruit of those bearing. And so curious as to what conclusions or recommendations for the long term some of the research indicated.
Yeah, I think a lot of things come back to education. And one of the things that is a driver of so much of this lack of inclusion is socioeconomic mobility or immobility, which is kind of what we have in the UK and across lots of countries in the world, that people are born in a certain set of circumstances, and because they're not able to get educated to the same sort of level as other people who are born in more wealthy circumstances, they can't ever actually change their position in society. And that, I think, is absolutely horrible. It's kind of the Victorian era. Even the Victorians were probably better at social mobility than we are today. So I think that's one area. Another area is helping aspiring young people who think about entrepreneurship to have a path into becoming founders. And at the moment, there's really no paths that exist that aren't just drop out of school and do a Mark Zuckerberg. And I think we need a lot more infrastructure for young people who do want to start companies in the future to help encourage them on that path. Another area that is a longer term piece of work is around inclusion and making sure that the funds that we have and the tech companies that we have are not just hiring people who are different to them, but are actually making sure those people have a good experience and thrive and enjoy working in those funds and in those companies. And at the moment, we're just not doing that. And there are some very short-term, very basic things. A lot of funds, a lot of companies don't have parental leave policies, for example. That would just be a very, very low-hanging fruit thing to put in place to make parents feel more welcome in the tech industry. Yeah,
those all seem like some of the points that we're seeing some great change in, and there's several countries that are doing it and leading the pack and showcasing best practices there. And so maybe this is a good point also to talk about the foundation for ADA. And on the tail end of some of the stuff that came out of Diversity VC, you guys decided, hey, we want to start this new fund and give things a go and take the best lessons from my first half of my career now to go into venture. So tell us how you got there. What was the rationale, and when did it happen? Was it over coffee? What was it? When?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I still look back and sort of pinch myself that I'm even in this position, because I know how privileged I am to be able to do this. And I wrote an article just after we launched ADA talking about that and talking about this sort of stacking of unfair opportunities and unfair advantages that I've had along the way to be able to do this. It also wasn't quite as kind of neat as we had coffee and then we decided to do a fund and then it happened. It was, let's say, a more organic process than that, but it really evolved from, as I said at the beginning, this shared mission that myself and Matt have had. So we were both working together at Downing, and we're now the founding partners of this new fund, ADA. And the mission really is about access to opportunities. So it's sort of very much related to the work that we're doing at Diversity VC, albeit this is about making money, financial returns. Our view is that the venture capital industry currently is only investing in a kind of narrow subset of opportunities, partly because they are the opportunities that the people who are in the industry kind of immediately understand and can immediately identify with. And we think that there are huge opportunities that are currently being missed as a result of that. And the reason the fund is called Ada is because there was this woman called Ada Lovelace, who was born in 1815, and she died at a young age, but was incredibly visionary and an amazing mathematician and sort of polymath. And she worked on something called the analytical engine, which is effectively the prototypical computer. And she was never really recognized for the contribution that she made, and she was never really given the opportunity to build on that and do great things with technology and innovation and science. And we see her story as being a huge amount of waste of where the world could be if someone like her had been given that opportunity and had been given that backing. And so the fund is called Ada to kind of remind us of people like Ada. We think there are people like Ada out there today who are currently being missed, who are currently not having the support and the financial opportunities that they deserve to make their visions a reality. So that was sort of the vision that we united around on Ada. And no fundraising process is straightforward, and it, as you know, is a super slow and kind of messy process. And I'm sure we made a huge number of mistakes, and we're in the process of trying to package those mistakes up and share them with other people to ensure that other people don't make the same ones as us.
So this is maybe a good point to also ask you about the distinction between a mission-driven fund, in which case, I don't know if you would let me describe Ada that way, versus a social impact fund and the distinctions therein. And how would you differentiate between the two?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I don't know if I'm the right person to have the answer on this. All I can tell you is kind of how I think about it and how we think about it. I think having a mission for any company is really important because, particularly when you hit these really bad times like the one we're in right now, your mission is the thing that sustains you through. And it has to go beyond just, I want to return 100 million to my investors. I do want to do that, of course, but actually I want to do that through also trying to realize this mission. I think social impact is actually quite a loaded term, which we found when we fundraised, put a lot of people off and was quite alienating for people, or they felt that there was an inherent sort of compromise at play there between financial returns and the impact that you wanted to create. And I think whenever we avoided that language, people understood that we were going to achieve the financial returns through the strategy and through the mission we had with Ada. But I think as soon as we started talking about impact, it was a trade-off. It seemed to be a trade-off in people's minds.
I think the reason I asked you the question, Chuck, is because part of seeing if one can make an impact, and by the way, this is something that we struggle with as others do, is you want to, you can qualify things, but at the end of the day, quantifying things is probably the easiest way, and hence the research reports you guys have done at Diversity VC. And social impact is one of those funny ones where at the end of the day, you're seeing a change, right? You're saying, I want to see a change in society this way, whether it be democratization of services, accessibility, diversity, and it's interesting how much people are put off by the term, and yet at the same time they want to promote the very things that the term encapsulates. And so it's kind of, how do you find that balance between doing that versus not doing that? And also there's pools of capital that are available for those that are willing to inherit that term versus not. And I maybe, if I know I'm a bit sort of making more of a statement than a question, but if you were to fix that dichotomy, what would you do? How would you enable there to be an equalization between that negative bias towards social impact by the very need of the very things social impact drives for?
I'll give it a go. Again, I'm not sure if I'm the right person for fixing this. It's a huge problem, and I think until we square that circle, or make that whole, I don't think we can really move this conversation on. So I think it's fundamental that we try to reconcile those two things. The language I found really helpful when talking actually to impact investors is this idea of a mission lock. So if you have a mission locked company, you have a company where doing more of what makes the company successful achieves more of the impact. So I'm now not going to be able to think of a good example. Andela, the education company, which was backed by Mark Zuckerberg and others, the more that they provide education to future developers, the more revenue they generate, but also the more impact they generate in terms of giving people the opportunity to be socially mobile and to get jobs where they'd be paid more. So I think that language is very clarifying, and it stops there being this misconception about some kind of trade-off, or some kind of, oh, your social's pulling you in this way and your commercial's pulling you in that way. So I think that's one part of it. I think the other part of it is possibly that these kind of separate pools of capital that call themselves impact almost should be, I think, combined into the main pool of capital. Because actually, my own view is that every dollar or every pound that's invested should be about trying to make the world a better place. I don't believe that we should be trying to fund things that contribute to climate change or poverty, or these massive global problems that we've got. And we've made it a very explicit part of our investment agreement with our investors that we will never fund anything that contributes to any of the world becoming a more inhospitable place, like climate change. So I think for there to be separate impact pools kind of calls into question, what are you doing with the main body of funding then? And why wouldn't that also be about trying to make positive impact on the world?
Yeah, and that's probably like a bigger question than the two of us can answer today, but it is a trend, right? It is a trend. You're seeing more, for example, like companies like Nutmeg offering social responsibility portfolios that didn't exist 5 years ago. And so how you define social responsibility is a separate question, but the fact that this is becoming more mainstream might ultimately point towards the convergence of those two pools of capital, rather than being two separate ones, with one being more of a charitable outcome and one being more of a financial outcome. But it's good, promising things. But moving to founders, what trends are you seeing in terms of what founders are? I know that there's been waves of entrepreneurship where there's been a mission, and that has been tied to, from a revenue point of view, also to like a social impact view. Like the poster child of this is like Tom Shoes, but moving away from D2C businesses and into more software businesses and more enterprise businesses, what are the trends that you're seeing right now in terms of what new companies are, and what founders that are coming to market today, are they more attuned to this? Are you seeing more of this happening?
Yeah, I am. I think just on that Tom Shoes example, I think that was one of the things that is a bit misleading, because actually on that example, even though every pair of shoes leads to they buy another pair of shoes, actually them creating more shoes and just doing better doesn't actually achieve more of the mission. They're doing something else separately. So I think what I'm enjoying seeing more of is more companies where the core proposition of what they're doing is actually achieving the impact. So I think WageStream is another kind of good example of people being able to access their salary earlier. Means they're less likely to be in poverty, and less likely to sort of go into debt or be using kind of lending, short-term lending. So definitely think this is a major trend, and I think it's going to become quite unusual in the next 5 years to meet founders that don't have a point of view about what their mission is. I mean, even earlier today, I was on a phone call with somebody who's been a founder and has been very successful, and has kind of stepped away from the previous business because they wanted to do something which had more impact. And I think that's really, really exciting. It's definitely exciting for a fund like ours, because that's the kind of founder and the kind of company that we're trying to fund.
Well, you've made 4 investments to date. Congrats.
Yeah, thank you.
Maybe you want to talk through some of the core of what, in your words, the core of what they're doing. Maybe you want to talk about what commonalities they have in terms of the core of what they're trying to drive change in.
Yeah, so two of them have not yet been announced, so I'm going to try and do this sort of dancing on a head of a pin thing of not mentioning them whilst talking about them, but two of them have been announced, so I can talk about those. But I guess more broadly, the strategy with Ada is about investing in these huge kind of demographic changes and trends that are sort of 10-20 year demographic trends, and thereby, you know, we think that there are these kind of overlooked markets in those trends, so they're not yet sort of fully played out and explored by the people. So the three sort of key trends are aging populations, the world becoming more globalized and more diverse, and the third is people under the age of 23. And so how the generation who's now Gen Z are going to be living kind of 10-20 years in the future. So the two sort of first investments we made are tying into the sort of latter part of those demographic shifts. The first one that I'll talk about is a company called Bubble, which is a babysitting marketplace and childcare marketplace. So this is a company which connects childcare on one side to parents that want short-term flexible childcare on the other. And it's a trend around the rise of women working, millennial parents being more and more comfortable with booking childcare as long as it's trusted through an app. And it's a company that we are really, really excited about because it is filling a huge chasm at the moment. There's you know, a lot of parents will tell you there's very few good options for finding vetted, reliable childcare quickly. So that's one investment. The other one is in the sort of more, well, both under the age of 20 and aging population sort of trend, is that it's a e-commerce fulfillment company called Habu, and it's based in Bristol, and it helps small retailers to do all of their fulfillment. So it has a kind of proprietary software system, and it does all the picking, packing, labeling, everything you can imagine related to fulfillment, apart from the actual delivery.
Yeah.
So those are the first two.
Nice. Well, we look forward to hearing the others when you can talk about them. So revisiting a question that I told you I was going to ask you earlier, this is the biggest mistake that you look back on your career and think, damn, that was a massive cock up, but I've learned so much from it, and it's now fundamental to some of the assumptions that I do right now. Any that you'd be willing to share?
So many, it's hard to pick any individual one, but I think in general in venture, there's, you know, a huge sort of mistake that it's very easy to make, which is, first of all, being intellectually arrogant and thinking that you know best, or that you know something. Secondly, in being too scared to say when you don't know something. And I've definitely fallen into that trap a lot. And I think it's just a terrible thing. It's just a terrible way to be with founders. And it's just much, much better to just say up front, if you don't know something or you can't help with something. You know, I don't have many years of experience. You know, I'm still very early in my career, really. So there's a lot I don't know about. And I think you can only really build trust in relationships when you share your own vulnerability. So that's one. Another one is about over communication. I think there's a power dynamic in venture between the VCs and the founders, and it's much harder to be a founder, and particularly if you don't get information from that VC. And I'm still working on this, and I'm still not perfect at it, but trying to constantly update founders with where you are and where your investment committee is, and make sure that they know where they stand, is essential, and is something I've been really guilty of not doing before. And I think that also extends to portfolio. Sometimes you can foresee something going wrong or being an issue, you're talking about it internally, you don't share it with the founders, and you inevitably then have that conversation with them 6 months afterwards, where it's now too late, they've run out of money, you're not supporting them as a fund, and it's incredibly unfair on them. So yeah, I think that there's lots and lots of mistakes like that, but a lot of them kind of come back to communication, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think probably the biggest mistake that I've made has been in that same bucket, and teaches you loads when you look back on it. Well, to wrap things up, I always like ask a couple of sort of unrelated questions. The first one is, and I know we've talked a lot about diversity, so you can give another answer to this one if you'd like, but it's like we look back at some of the things that humanity's done over the last 100 years. Think about slavery or something like that, and you think, wow, how did we let that happen as a society? What do you think 50 years in the future we'll look back on today and think, wow, how did we let that happen?
Yeah, a few things. I mean, I'm sure you've heard this question before and had the sort of vegetarianism or eating animals answer, which I agree with. I'm not a vegetarian, but I can see why in 50 or 100 years time that's going to look completely barbaric. But I think for me, it's back to what I was saying before about education and lack of advancement. People kind of are still born into situations and totally unable to get out of them. And I think that's just completely wrong. And I think in the future, where you're born and what your passport color is and who your parents are will not have the same bearing as it has today on your future opportunities. And I think it just has an absolutely disproportionate bearing on those opportunities today. So I hope that changes.
Yeah, no, I hope so too. That is there is a key point there. All right, so last one, superpower. So if you could be one of the Avengers characters, which one would you be, or which superpower would you like to have?
Okay, I'm gonna probably get judged for this, but I'm not a Marvel fan. Sorry, so I'm not really an Avengers watcher. But I think I think it would be. I don't know if this is one, but one of the things that I've talked about just now, but is communication and is the ability to speak to people. I think so many problems could be avoided if we could just communicate better with each other. So something about reading people's minds would be amazing.
Charles Xavier.
Having that. Is that the one?
Yeah, he reads everyone's minds.
Okay.
Powerful.
Okay, that's the one.
There you go. Well, there you go, guys. Check. Thanks so much for joining us. Really great to chat and hear your story and the future for Ada. How can people and founders get hold of you if they want to get in touch?
Just check at adaventures.com. Emails on our website, and I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn and all sorts of other platforms.
All the usuals.
So get in touch. Yeah, please.
Cool. And so with that, guys, thanks for joining us. Bye.
Thank you so much for having me. Bye.